Morning, mate.
Morning, Paul. How's the form?
It's very good. You're sounding very good. I don't know whether to call you Robbie Martin or Georgie Best, but welcome all to a chapter of my life. First time in this series I've been joined by an actor rather than an author. It is Robbie Martin, who plays George Best in Hello, Goodbye, Goodbye George, Hello Best. That's the right way round, isn't it?
No. It's Hello, Georgie. Goodbye, Best.
Ah, well, there you go. Making these schoolboy errors makes people sit up, think, and remember more, because you always remember from your mistakes. And you could argue that George made a mistake in 1971 when he didn't turn up for he missed the train, didn't he, that took the players down to Chelsea. But he'd already arranged an engagement with Sinead O'Connor, so decided to go directly to her house rather than go to Stamford Bridge and join up the boys. But let's talk about the backstory. You and Rafi wrote this a few years ago now, didn't you? And the inspiration was going to the Edinburgh Fringe and watching a one-man show about Frank Carson. So you take on the story.
Yeah, that's right. You've got a great memory, Paul. That's I'd actually forgotten about that bit myself. Yeah, it was back in 2017. We'd just finished drama school, and I'd gone up to see an actor that I know from home, who'd written a one-man show about Frank Carson, and it was fantastic, and it just kind of blew my mind, and that sort of sowed the seeds in my head. Well, who could I play from sort of real life? And that's I'd always had an interest in George, because he's obviously such a fascinating character. And one of my old football coaches actually used to call me Bestie because he thought I had a similar resemblance to him. So it was always sort of there, but it just took me to go up to watch that Frank Carson show, which suddenly I had that sort of eureka moment where this could make something really interesting. So that sent me down the tunnel of nearly 4 year now sort of obsession with George Best. So yeah, we just basically started researching it, and then as you said, we put on the play a couple of years ago in Edinburgh, and we had sort of bigger plans for it, but then lockdown obviously came, so that kind of put that to bed. So we used that time to sort of do more research, and it's amazing. I don't know, how many George books you've read, but there must be, I've got about 30 in my study, of either ones written by him or ones written about him, or just that era of United in general. And we sort of did a bit more research around, we went to the British Library and sort of dug up all the newspaper archives from that week. And it was an incredible story. It kind of, the more and more you dig, it just becomes more incredible that this actually happened. And I think trying to explain that to sort of present day football fans, they just can't really get their heads around it either. So yeah.
I don't think present day football fans can get their heads around what went on in the 70s. I'm an absolute nut obsessed. I don't know what the word is. Someone that's obsessed with something. Yeah. That is me, an absolute nerd with the 70s.
Yeah, it was just, it was interesting because we kind of were able to piece back the kind of the build up to George going missing that weekend, and we were sort of looking at the end of 1970, when just before Wilf McGuinness was sacked, and United really were going down a very bad sort of spell. Like, they were close to being relegated, or the relegation zone, the bottom two clubs, and at that stage, and they were losing matches really, really badly. They had, I don't know if you remember, they had their centre back pairing at the time was Ian Urie and Steve James. They'd kind of lost Bill Folkes, and Dave Sadler had an injury, so they had Ian Urie and Steve James at the back, and they were shipping at least 2 or 3 goals a game, and everyone was beating them. And it was amazing, to read the match reports back then, and everyone was talking about, how United had gone from, 2.5 years previously winning the European Cup to then becoming the sort of the whipping boys of the first division, everyone kind of looked forward to playing them, and it's sort of similar to what happened to United after Ferguson, but in a way it was a bigger fall after Busby. He had just been the man for so long, and he tried to sort of use McGuinness as his protege to kind of continue on his legacy, but it just completely backfired. And it wasn't really fair on Wilf, because he was actually a very good coach. He was just the right man at the wrong time, and they just they had too many players who had come up through the ranks with him, the likes of Bobby Charlton and other ones who he just never really seemed to be able to gain the respect of. But I think for United fans, they people don't actually realise, people all sort of hail Busby as this legend and everyone loved him, but there's a very toxic atmosphere in the United dressing room back then. People like, there were the Busby loyalists like Paddy Crerand and maybe Alex Stepney and people like that, but there were people like maybe Nobby Stiles and other guys who were actually handing in transfer requests. People don't realize, like Brian Kidd handed in a transfer request during that period. A lot of people wanted to get out of Old Trafford, but George was kind of left there thinking, God, there was all these cliques forming, and he couldn't deal with that. He just wanted to win football matches, and this is where he really started to struggle. Everyone says it was the alcohol and everything else and the women, but really where George's troubles started, where they were all to do with football.
I think that's an absolute fair assessment, because George has always maintained that when United were, at the pump, alcohol wasn't really a problem. It's when United started going down. And he'd always said they replaced players with inferior players. Bless him, I don't think he ever mentioned them by name, because he was too much of a professional and too much of a nice guy for that. But United, in their defence, were trying to recruit. I know for a fact that Busby had almost signed Alan Clark from Leicester.
Yeah.
Sorry, from Fulham. He went to Leicester and then moved on to Leeds United after. They were also sniffing around Malcolm McDonald. They brought in Ian Storey-Moore. So, and also they'd identified Tony Curry as Bobby Charlton's replacement. So United were, it wasn't as though they were asleep at the wheel, so to speak. They were trying, but these were turbulent times for United. Only a few years after winning the European Cup, and sometimes when a team gets so old, too old together, and such great names and great players, it's very difficult replacing and knowing when's the time to bring in the new blood.
Yeah, I think it was difficult, because also Busby had that loyalty to those guys who had won the European Cup for him, and he wanted to let them sort of finish their careers on their own terms. And there, as you say, there were certain players, but I think this is when football players' transfers had really started to go on the upward scale. And Busby, people say he was tight, but when he had to spend money, he would have. He spent 130,000 on Dennis Law, and he bought Paddy Crerand from Celtic. But I think this is when there was the likes of, I think they wanted to get Colin Todd, and they wanted. I think George really wanted Mike England from Blackburn, and he wanted Alan Ball from Everton. But I think Busby felt the transfers that were required for those sort of players at sort of the end of the 60s, early 70s were just too high. And the problem was, everyone had sort of caught up with United with their scouting network. So in the 50s, they sort of had that jump over everyone, because their scouting network was so much better than everyone else. But then when it got into the late 60s, Jimmy Murphy had sort of been sidelined when Wilf McGuinness had come in. Not by Wilf per se, but he had just sort of began to ease out of the club by other forces. And I think that's when they really suffered as well, because he was such a big part. Everyone talks about Busby, but Jimmy Murphy was as much, a force in United, being the powerhouse that they were. So there was a lot of things going on, which within the club, which was causing them to go on this downward spiral. But I think George there was just far too much reliance on him at this stage to, even for all the things that he did, the likes of Wilf McGuinness and Frank O'Farrell always said, well, they couldn't drop him, because when they did drop him, the team suffered. I mean, they were so heavily reliant on him. And I think this was really, with the external factors in George's life, it sort of we were that created this sort of maelstrom of identity crisis, nervous breakdown, whatever you want to call it. But this sort of period where Busby takes back over the team, George is just really he's really suffering at the moment, but he's not telling anyone, and this is where we get the build up to him going missing for the Chelsea game.
Because after all said and done, I mean, George was the fifth Beatle. George filled more columns of newspaper space than anybody else. George had model looks. George was the best footballer that not only of these shores seen at that time, but seen since. George was everything that everybody wanted to be George Best. Everybody wanted a piece of George Best, but George was a quiet, introvert person, wasn't he? I mean, my pal Alan Hudson talks a lot about his friend George Best, and when Chelsea played Manchester United, both George loved playing against Chelsea and Chelsea loved playing against George, and there was speculation around at that time that George was going to join Osgood, Charlie Cook and Alan Hudson at Chelsea. I think it would have pushed Dave Sexton over, to be quite truthful. but Alan always says, whenever he was in George's company, George never talked about football. He never talked about himself. He was just the most modest person that he's met, and that is the biggest trait, and one of the greatest traits that a person can have. Certainly in Alan Hudson's view, and in mine too, modesty. George had modesty in abundance as well, didn't he?
Yeah, I think he had. I think that he was intrinsically Northern Irish in the terms that he was always polite and had manners. He was very well raised in that sense. He had a huge ego, but the thing which was okay about that was because his talent probably was even greater than the ego still. I think that I was always told that, it's fine to have an ego, but the ego just can't be bigger than the talent, and certainly in George's case it wasn't. But he was a serial winner. He had to win. And I think you're right. He didn't like talking about football outside of it, but football was what he lived for. That was the thing he loved. And I think once this period of United doing so badly, it really affected him because he attributed winning to his self-worth. And I think he'd started to realize during this period that without football, what am I? And I think you mentioned the fifth Beatle there. I think that was something which as had begun in sort of the mid '60s,
Yeah.
and I think he started to retreat more into that image once the football started going wrong because he thought that could replace the excitement. But which was, I mean, we all would have done that. Who wouldn't have done that? But it just in the long run, it just created this sort of split personality, which we were to see play out over the next 30 odd years, where you could get George, who was just a very nice, well-mannered, funny, charismatic man, or you could get Georgie, who, could be a bit of a narcissist and could be not a very pleasant person to be around. And I think that's, unfortunately, the seeds were sown for that at this sort of stage. And I think, and you're completely right what you say about he should have just moved. Anyone, if you think of any of the stars today, if Juventus suddenly started to go downhill, Ronaldo would be out of there like a shot. But the thing about George was that at Man United was his spiritual home. Matt Busby was his father figure. I think one of the big things we realized recently was he'd sort of harbored that feeling of feeling sort of separated from his family whenever he had to move away, because obviously back then the club didn't move your family over. And George is very close to his family and his parents. And once that he sort of felt slightly abandoned when he first moved to Manchester, not through anyone's fault. That was just the way it was back then. I think once Matt Busby had stepped down the second time, he then felt the feelings of abandonment that he felt as a 15-year-old came flooding back. And I think that's what really sort of set the wheels in motion for this period.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on, because famously George, when he first come home, he did go back, didn't he, because he was homesick. Have you contacted, or have the family contacted you about this play that you and Rafi have put together? What's their take if they have?
Yeah, well, yeah, I've spoken to George's sister Barbara
Yeah.
and her husband Norman, who run or have the rights to the estate. They are the executors of his estate, and they're very supportive of the play. And I think their main thing is they want it to be about, because obviously mental health was not spoken about back then. It was kind of, it just was very, it's not like we are today where, even the likes of, the Euro final last week, that was such a big thing, trying to, and rightly so, talking about those guys' mental health and all that sort of thing, protecting them. But there was nothing like that back then. And people, if people want to go, I mean, they can go and do the research themselves. But if you go and look at the bashing like George would take in the newspapers week in, week out, I mean, you can only imagine the effect that was having, not only on him, but his mum and dad. And I think that was something which George felt hugely ashamed about, was the effect that the bad press had on his parents and his mum especially. And I think that really did. I've sort of identified this in my own background as well, but Protestant shame, I think people, especially working class people from Belfast, they were very proud people, and that, they provided for their families, and they, went to work Monday to Friday, went to church on a Sunday, very simple, hardworking people. And I think George became very that was what he was used to growing up. And I think the more he pulled away from that, it kind of really affected him mentally. So I think this is what the family today really want to try and, because George still, people still do a lot of mudslinging about George even today, about the things that he did. And there are things that happen, especially later on in his life, that are indefensible. But I think we can see, certainly that the support, emotionally wasn't there when he was going through this real bad period in the early 70s, and it wasn't really anyone's fault. It's just it wasn't really discussed back then. I'm sure even from the other players that you've talked to, they've, had their own problems with addictions and, what do you do after you stop playing football? But unfortunately, that's just the way it was.
Yeah, spot on. It's and again, what people have to understand is we're talking about one of the greatest players, again, not just in this country, but in the world. At that time, Pelé described George as the greatest player in the world. George was up there with, if football is a religion, then George was one of the prophets. George Best was an artist whose canvas was the grass, and George was completely different on the pitch and off the pitch. And you're right, that mental health scenario, it must have been like living in a goldfish bowl for George, because the press aren't like what the press are today. The press, everything that George did, they followed his every move, and you're right, would hammer, would hammer, would hammer. The British press have always liked to do that, build people up and then smash people down. So what George Best's mental state would have been like around that weekend, because it just he'd been down to London, hadn't he, for an FA inquiry with a situation involving Pardo in the
Yeah.
Manchester derby. There
Yeah.
was an awful lot going on around that time with George, and when you look at it in, the full picture, not the bits that, because you're right, some people just take them little bits that they want to, but when you look at that full picture, every person has that moment where they just want to run and hide and explode, and I'm guessing that George, given that Sinead, it was Irish as well, and in London, and very similar in backgrounds to George, had already arranged a date with Sinead, but probably took a lot of solace and comfort in both of them loose cannons, if you like, just laying off their troubles to each other over a glass of wine.
Yeah, or two.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think I was actually reading about during lockdown. Someone had sent me a book on, it was called, I think it was something that was about loneliness anyway. But I read it. There was a description of it that said loneliness agitates in two directions, away from threat and towards intimacy. And if ever you could describe what George Best did, was that's what he did. He'd avoid confrontation, and he wanted intimacy with someone. He not necessarily, I don't mean per se sexual, but he
Absolutely.
just wanted someone to talk to or
Yeah.
try and open up with. And I think that's what Sinead represented at that time was, and it was, as you say, it was a real crazy week. And in fact, the previous year had been very, he had done some things which he was really blasted in the press for, such as he had knocked the ball out of a referee's hand during a League Cup semi-final. He'd thrown mud at a referee during an Ireland-Scotland game, and he'd had another sort of booking offence which had led to, as you say, the FA disciplinary hearing. But the Glenn Pardo incident wasn't. It was, he actually got off on that because they'd had the film footage of it and they'd shown that it actually was an accident. So, but as you say, he turned up. He'd due to be, I think it was Monday, maybe the 5th of January. He was due at this, or it was Monday the 4th. He was due at this FA disciplinary hearing, and he had been out the night before. And Busby had turned up at Lancaster Gate, but no George. And everyone's wondering where he is, and I think they blamed fog, because apparently it was a foggy morning. I mean, it's hilarious reading through these newspaper articles, and so apparently George's business associate Malcolm Mooney had got him on a later train, and so he turned up 5 hours late. And I think this was in one of the books as well. Apparently he was going up in the elevator, and he was sick in front of Busby in the elevator just before they were about to go in. And I think Busby just didn't know what to do. And George is hugely embarrassed. And they actually had managed to get off relatively scot-free in the hearing. He got a 6-week suspended sentence, providing he didn't have another booking offence within the next year. So they think they'd got off. They were quite happy with that outcome. But then the next night, the Tuesday, they had an FA Cup replay against Middlesbrough. And you can watch this on YouTube. It's on a snow-covered pitch. Middlesbrough at this time were in the 2nd division, and they won the replay 2-1, and so that was kind of United's last chance of silverware that season, because they were out of contention for the league and everything. So this was sort of one of Busby's maybe second game back in charge, so the club were sort of at a real down here, and this is where George goes missing from training for the rest of that week before the Chelsea game, and he doesn't turn up for the train on Friday lunchtime to go down to London. And this is where it gets even funny. This is like a scene out of a film. He arrived at Manchester Airport, got a flight, a BEA, British European Airways, for anyone who remembers them, down to Heathrow. And to avoid getting past the journalists, they disguised him as an air steward. They put him in a flat cap, bunged him into a van at Heathrow, drove him past the journalists to go to the Euston Square Hotel in London. And so George comes, even though, and Busby, by the way, has already sent a telegram to George's house telling him not to come, but George sort of apparently didn't get it and come down anyway. And so George arrives, and as you can imagine, in the lobby, the Man United team, I think, are sitting around having afternoon tea, and George comes in, and you could probably hear a pin drop, and Busby's just sort of giving him the eyes from across the room, and gives him a feel like apparently the dressing down was, Busby had just been pushed too far. And he really told George that he was to get back up to Manchester, and they would deal with the matter next week. And well, of course, what did George do? He didn't go back up to Manchester and do what he was told. He made the short, probably half-hour walk from Euston Hotel to Islington, sort of just out at Regent's Canal, to go to Sinead's flat, as you say, when he was due to meet her for a date the following day after the Chelsea game, but he showed up a day early. And that was, sort of where our play begins, is George turning up.
Now, they went out, didn't they, to a restaurant, and is that how they were spotted when they went back to Sinead's flat? Because on the Sunday morning, the every person with a camera and a pen was camped outside her flat, and at the end of the day, I mean, he's not a mass murderer, he's not committed any crime, he just missed a game of football against Chelsea.
This is where I think there's conflicting evidence on how they found out he was there. Something which I found out, or which I really realised working with other people on this project over lockdown, was actually how much George tried to use the press at times. And I think this is the first time really he tried to use the press against Busby. So I don't know if he planned to create this standoff with Busby and he wanted the journalist to sort of create this media siege in order to bite back against Busby. But because he was, there was little snippets of things that Sinead was going, because she was going down to the doorstep and getting, a pint of milk and newspapers, whatever, and she was getting little quotes. But George never really came down and spoke to the press. It was like he wanted to create this, and George was very clever like that. He knew how to play the media, but the only person who knew how to play the media better than him was Busby.
Yep.
And I think he was doing it so Busby would come down and forgive him. He wanted someone to put an arm around him, but he just went to, like George, there was a really good quote from John Roberts, who we interviewed, who was George's ghostwriter, and he said, George would go through these periods where he'd bottle things up, and then he would make this real erratic decision without consulting anyone. And I think that was one of the things that happened this weekend. So I don't know whether he let the media know he was there. I can't say for certain, but I wouldn't be surprised, because I think he wanted Busby to realise how badly he was hurting and how much the team's form was getting on him, on top of him. So it's a sad thing, but ultimately all the snippets that George was putting out to the press that weekend was saying that all his problems were to do with football. And then of course Busby was saying, well, I don't know, they're nothing to do with football, it must be a personal thing. And eventually George, it got, as I think you probably know, it got to such a stage at the weekend that on the Monday morning the police had to be called, because they were just, this is, if you can imagine back then, they had outside broadcast trucks there, and that was like a big deal back then. Usually you would just get a few reporters with pens and papers, but this was like, there was news crews, there was TV crews. That was a huge deal. Obviously today it's part and parcel, but back then that was only for royal weddings or something. You got those sorts of things. And so, you can just imagine the chaos that the police eventually had to be called. And it was actually the police, because they had gone up to check on George, and they probably just wanted to see who he was with, or whatever. And then they came back down and they left the front door to the building open. They had left it sort of ajar, and all the school kids were there on the Monday, and they'd broken in. And then, of course, all the journalists followed through. So if you can imagine, I've actually been in the building. There's this sort of stairwell, and there was apparently a huge crush. There was, kids caught in this, and eventually the door to the flat just burst open because of this crush. So, and then there's just George there with Sinead, and it's absolute pandemonium. So eventually George, he didn't get the outcome that he wanted. He had to eventually be rescued by his business partner Malcolm Mooney, who had to take him back up to Manchester. And eventually George just conceded to Busby and just said, yeah, it's my fault, my problems, they're personal problems, they're nothing to do with football, which of course was a complete lie. They were all to do with football. But he had to do what Busby, he had to apologise to Busby in order to be forgiven. And it was just a real bad situation. And I think that meeting, which took place between George and Busby, I think was really well talked about actually in I'm not sure if you read about or listened to your interview with Wayne Barton, but he talked a lot about that meeting. And I think George really broke down. But the problem was that I don't think they still didn't address the problems, and what we were to go on seeing were the repeat of the same things again and again. And it was just incredibly sad, because George is obviously still revered by Man United fans today, but this is all happening when he's only 24, and you just think it was such a bad shame that the problems were just never really sorted out.
It's quite an incredible story. How long does your play go on for? Because there's an awful lot to put in there. And do you have all the school kids on the stairs as well?
No, we didn't have the budget for that. Well, I think hopefully maybe one day we think we might get a film version of it done, but yeah. It's out of my hands, sort of thing. But yeah, the play basically only looks at what goes on between George and Sinead inside the flat, and it's lucky we've got lots of archive footage, so you can see the press and everything, and the journalists outside, doing the broadcast. So it sort of does bring it to life a bit. So yeah, unfortunately we don't have anyone to play Busby or anything, just because, and it's difficult because Busby is sort of such a big part of the story, but
Yeah.
it's actually what goes on between it's basically in the flat, it's George trying to be honest. I think that was always George's biggest drawback, was that he couldn't be honest with other people. He couldn't open up, he couldn't tell people, he always tried to deflect. Even when you look at interviews, and even the people that he was close to, like Michael Parkinson, he couldn't, when he was asked, the famous "where did it all go wrong," he had to tell the story about the hotel and the money and the bellboy. He could never admit that actually he wasn't really happy with his career. He did only really have half a career, and it's incredibly sad. That's why I think people find George Best endlessly fascinating, is because he was like this Greek mythological character. He was, it was almost like he knew the path that he was going down, and he was sort of okay with that. But what we were left with was kind of, a very tragic story. But it's, as you say, it's still amazing that he's still considered one of the greatest players of all time, really only sort of having a career up until the age of sort of 24, 25.
It is unbelievable, and I just think it's testament to what an absolutely fantastic talent George Best was. George Best's legacy will live forever, and I think it's fantastic that you are doing plays like this, and other people are writing books like Wayne's wrote the book about George Best. There's autobiographies, there's endless scores of reels of information about George, and George's family have got the official George Best Facebook page, Twitter, etc. So long may that continue, because with players like George, they should never be forgotten, because what they gave us was special. Okay, fair play. It's a shame that it didn't go on for longer, but the little bit that
Yeah.
George gave us was so much more greater than most football players that we've ever seen in all of their entire careers. So thank you, Robbie, and thank you, George, for all those wonderful memories. Where can people hook up with you, Robbie, and how can people see this play? How long's the play running for? And Guillaume Balaguer has done a bit of retweeting as well. Where does that
Yeah.
connection come from with Guillaume? Because he's
Oh,
quite a star in his own right.
yeah. Yeah, he randomly came to see the play, and we did it in Edinburgh, and he was very, like, he tweeted about it afterwards. I've never actually met him face to face, but we sort of kept in touch since then, and he's very nice to do a promotional tweet. But yeah, I think he sort of appreciated the fact that, I think everyone knows about the football with George Best, but I think what we were trying to show is the more human side.
Yep.
That vulnerability, because everyone knows the quotes, the Miss World, the giving up booze for 20 minutes, and it was been the worst 20 minutes of my life. Everyone knows all that, but what they don't know is what George Best actually felt underneath, and I think that's what we were trying to say with this play. So yeah, he was very nice in giving us that help. But the play runs, from the 27th of July to the 5th of August. It's in the Isle of Dogs in London, sort of near Canary Wharf. So all the details are on my Twitter. It's Robbie3 Martin, or we have a Facebook group called Hello Georgie Goodbye Best as well. But also, excitingly, for people who aren't able to get down to see the show, we're getting a film crew in one day, and we're gonna shoot a couple of runs of the play and edit it together, and then do a sort of a live stream. So we'll be able to sort of broadcast the play to people, across the UK and the world here, because we've had a lot of interest in people, wanting to see this. So hopefully we'll be able to get it. That's one of the sort of the benefits of lockdown, that theatres had to sort of adapt and try in other ways of getting shows out to the audience. So this is something we're doing. So hopefully more people can see the play.
Now, will the play be going elsewhere after the Isle of Dogs? Because it is a must-see play. Are you going to
Yeah,
be come to Birmingham, to Manchester, but back over
yeah,
to Belfast?
yeah.
Everybody wants a piece of George, surely.
Yeah, I think definitely, well, Manchester being George's spiritual home, I
Yeah.
think I'd really like to do one up there. It's just it's I guess there's just so much uncertainty at the minute. I mean, with COVID and everything, I mean, we've even really struggled to like get the play on for this run. So I think we'll probably do one step at a time. But yeah, I think ideally, if the appetite's there for it, we'd love to do it. And I think it's a story which, will not just resonate with football people. It's really more about life than about football, and about, trying to overcome adversity, which everyone can sort of relate to.
And how's Rafi finally? How's her side with being Sinead Cusack? How's the young lady doing?
Yeah, she's actually just training here. She's doing a kettlebell workout. So
Doing a what?
she's doing a kettlebell workout here in front of me.
Kettlebells. What's that mean? Making your coffee?
Yeah, actually, I'll bring her out here and she can answer for herself.
Okay.
Rafi, Paul wants to know about how you're finding playing Sinead.
Oh, hello.
Hi,
Hi.
Rafi. How are ya?
I'm good.
What's this kettlebell workout that you're doing as well? By the way.
Yeah, I don't know why I've chosen to do it on such a hot day, but there you go. So Sinead is really interesting to play this time around, especially because I think we've delved a lot deeper into her backstory and this amazing kind of link between her and George, and the way they end up in this flat together this weekend, and the sort of stakes for both of them. I guess her story sort of parallels his. It kind of acts in tandem, but the different way you could sort of, when high pressure sort of happens, that the event in the flat is really bad, but she sort of chooses to take it one way, but George, being the person that he was, sort of can't help himself take it to an even worse place in his life, really.
And I'm guessing you found it really easy working with Robbie as well, because as those two only spent the weekend in the flat, you guys are all the time in the same flat, aren't you?
Especially after lockdown and everything. No, it's a pleasure to work with him. He's, so capable and a really generous actor. So I do think, people say to us often, oh, don't you bicker or don't you quarrel if you're working together all the time? But I really think if you're in something creative and you have that opportunity to do that with people close to you, then there's nothing quite like being on stage with them.
Absolutely. And you co-wrote that as well with Robbie, didn't you? So it's your work as much as it's Robbie's.
Yeah, although he's the George best fanatic.
Of course, he looks like George as well. Do you look like Sinead?
When she was younger, a fair, not as much as Robbie looks like George.
Yeah, he's a ringer, isn't he?
Yeah.
You lucky girl.
Thank you.
Well, you better go back to your kettlebell ringing or whatever. What actually is it? What is that?
Workout, like kettlebells, like the weights.
Oh, right. Oh, okay, yeah.
Bell ringing.
Okay, it sounds like fantastic fun, but not as much fun as the stage. Hello, Georgie. Goodbye, best. Thank you, Rafi. Could you just put Robbie back on? I'll just say ta-ra to Robbie as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Paul.
Hey, mate. She really sounded out of breath there, didn't she? You're working her hard.
Yeah, I mean, it's the heat. It's the heat.
It kills you, don't it? It absolutely kills you. So, Robbie, can I thank you so much? All the very, very best. I'll be retweeting and sharing, and this podcast will be up shortly. Finally, is there anything else that you have to add as either Robbie or as George?
No, I think we've more or less covered all bases, haven't we? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I should say, yeah, anyone with any sort of mild interest in football or anything, there are a few sort of surprises that I don't think even the most fanatic of George Best people will not expect to come up in this performance, in this play. So yeah, and as I say, we'll be able to hopefully as well sort of hopefully around mid-August we'll have a streamed version of the play, so we'll be able to get it out to a wider audience.
Brilliant. Can I wish you and Rafi all the very best going forward, and thank you so much time again, Robbie, for your time, sir, and good luck with everything that you do, not just this play but everything for the future as well. And please keep in touch, because we'll do a few more podcasts to help and support you guys going forward.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time.
Cheers, pal, and thanks for listening, guys. Ta-ra a bit.